George in that corner.
Okay, you're on.
You're on.
Thank you, George. Casey, come up here. You'll want one of these maps that everybody else has. So the advertising poster gave a certain rationale for this talk, which I may as well repeat, even though I think probably most of you heard me say it before. In secondary school, well, in primary school, we learned quite a bit about Egypt and Greece and Rome. And then there was this big gap. I mean, the way I remember it, which is, I'm sure, false, is that one day in 7th grade on a Monday, the Goths sacked Rome in the year 410. And then on Tuesday, Attila died in 453. And then on Wednesday, Muhammad made his pilgrimage in 622. And on Thursday, Charles Martel defeated the Moors at Tours in 732. And on Friday, Charlemagne died in 814. And we never went back to those 400 years again. You know, poof.
You had better school than I did. You learned about Muhammad. He didn't exist in my school.
Oh, well, there. Yeah, no, we did. And, you know, I mean, they probably talked about him for half an hour. I don't know. But it just, you know, you sort of, the early Middle Ages was a blank. And in fact, I said this at the end of my talk last time, but now I'm motivated to say it right now. Part of the reason is how little was known about the Goths, the Huns, the Vandals, and the Franks. And an awful lot of what we know now was discovered by Soviet archaeologists at the time that we were all in high school. Okay, so that, you know, that knowledge then takes a long time to get into a curriculum or anything. In fact, it probably never has, but the point is that a lot of what's known now wasn't even known when we were that age. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'm thinking of my talk as consisting of 16 paragraphs, of which this is paragraph 1. And now we go to paragraph 2, which has to do with the early Goths. If you look at your little map, you see the Goths apparently coming out of Scandinavia. This is I hesitate to call it a fiction, that's too strong a word, but it's something that was reported by a 6th century Gothic historian named Jordanes. This guy was living down in the Eastern Roman Empire, and he had Gothic background, you know. So he wanted to detail the history of the Goths, and he had them coming out of Scandinavia. Well, archaeology doesn't bear this out. The Goths could have come from Scandinavia, but actually there's no evidence of any seaworthy ships. You know, in that, the period when the Goths arrived or are known to have been in, let's say, northern Poland, it's like the 1st and 2nd century, okay? And there's no evidence that any large group of people came across the Baltic Sea in that time. It's true that the Gothic language is closely related to the languages of Scandinavia, but the movement was probably the other way. You know, people arrived in Scandinavia by going all the way around the Baltic Sea and then somehow trickling down. You know, we don't have any evidence that anybody was doing big seafaring expeditions in those early years. Anyway, the Goths migrated probably just for reasons of expansion. They began to learn somehow, maybe from the Roman expansion, they began to learn the methods of intensive agriculture, and their population was growing. And the direction in which they grew was southeastward. So they grew sort of where this arrow is going, over towards the Black Sea. You see the pink arrow of the Goths is taking them towards the southeast. And they went, and they seem to have arrived in groups, some small groups, probably some big groups, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And it wasn't until the 4th century that they changed directions abruptly, probably because the Huns began to appear. The Huns appeared in maybe the 370s in that region and started pushing the Goths in a different direction. Let me see what I needed to say. Okay, Visigoths and Ostrogoths are two groups that didn't really exist until the end of the 4th century. There were different Gothic tribes who seemed to be distinguished from one another. There were the Groithuni, who mostly became Ostrogoths, and the Tervii, who mostly became Visigoths. But the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths were a pair of political confederations. I mean, it's rather like the United States. It's not an ethnic group. It's people decided that, we need to be in this mutual defense league, and probably because of the Huns, actually. All right, I'll go to paragraph 3, which has to do with Ulfilas. Ulfilas. Who has ever heard of Ulfilas? Ulfilas, you Christian people. Ulfilas was a bishop, and he was an important bishop because he decided to attempt to translate the Gospels into Gothic. And actually, for that reason, we know the Gothic language quite well, because we have the whole Gospel of John written in Gothic. And we have parts of the other Gospels written in Gothic, and we have Psalm number, I forget what. We have a few other fragments of things written in Gothic. Well, how could this be when Gothic wasn't even a written language itself? There was no Gothic writing. So this guy, Ulfilas, he used the Greek alphabet, and he added to it a few characters to represent some of the sounds in Gothic that don't exist in Greek. So in this way, he had an alphabet for Gothic, and he certainly knew the words. He knew the vocabulary of Gothic. So, the translation was done probably not all by him, but by him and some team that he assembled. He was operating in a region that we would now call Bulgaria. Okay, so this is, he fled from some people probably because he was part of the Arian faction. Arian heresy, do we know what that is? Some of us are nodding our heads and some of us aren't. Okay, so Arius was an early figure in the Christian church whose argument was that Jesus was a creation of God, rather than consubstantial with God. There's this big argument about homoousians and homeousians, and it's just sort of, are you the same as God, or are you just similar to God? This is people are really, what a conflict, what huge conflicts over this question of whether Jesus was part of God or God made Jesus or what. Why this became the bone of contention is je ne sais pas. But anyway, that was the big thing. And this Ulfilas, his family happened to have come to Christianity at a time when the Arians were dominant. And so he was an Arian. And the Goths whom he converted to Christianity were Arians. And then it was politically very convenient for the Goths to go on being Arians, because they had their Christian churches, the Goths did, but because they weren't Nicene Catholics, they never had to have anything to do with the Pope. Their bishops, they had their own kind of structure of how they were going to put the church together, and never the twain shall meet. The Ostrogoths, I think, were Arians forever. For as long as there were Ostrogoths, which takes us through most of the 6th century. The Visigoths eventually, in Spain, some Visigothic later converted to Catholicism. Oh my gosh. But that was much later too. It was like 600 AD, or hundreds of years later. And the Vandals, oh my goodness, the Vandals, their whole mission in life was to kill Catholics. They were Arians, and we Arians just don't put up with this Nicene stuff. And, all right. I'm going far afield. So, yeah. No, I mean, it was much more sectarian than today, I think. I mean, I guess Northern Ireland might be an example of how it was, probably. Where religion is like an excuse to really kill people. All right, that was paragraph 3. Paragraph 4, we will mention that you don't have kings and soldiers and people like that until you have a considerable agricultural surplus. If everybody's just subsistence, how do you support kings and soldiers and manufacturers and other people? But the Goths, as they learned more and more about the intensive agriculture of the Romans, they got pretty good at this, and they started to have kings and soldiers. So in the 4th century, you get a figure named Ermanaric, a member of the Groithungi, and Ermanaric was said to have ruled from the Baltic to the Black Sea, which is probably not possible, actually, that he had that large a territory that he was really controlling closely. But anyway, he was Mr. Bigwig, and he lived until 376. There are various stories of why he died. Part of the story is certainly the Huns. It is said, one of the stories is that when he realized that he couldn't defend his territory or his people against the Huns, he committed suicide. Another story has to do with something about some woman he had wronged, and the brother, wounded him, and then he was vulnerable, and then all these old stories are like that. It's always some kind of infidelity in the family. Okay. Anyway, so Ermanaric is one of the earliest king-like figures that we have in these societies. Oh, he even makes his way into Beowulf, Ermanaric, which is a West Germanic thing. So, and these people are East Germanic. So, his fame kind of went far and wide. Okay, so we've kind of gotten to the Huns, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Huns. I go back to Jordanes. Do you remember Jordanes, whom I mentioned a little while ago? You probably don't. He was a 6th century historian of Gothic descent, and he tried to detail the history of the Goths. Now, there's a lot of fiction in Jordanes. I mean, besides him having the Goths coming from Scandinavia, which they probably didn't, he had the Amazons being a bunch of Gothic women. And then, where did the Huns come from? Well, according to Jordanes, where the Huns came from went like this. Some Gothic village expelled a bunch of witches, and the witches went out into the forest. And there they were impregnated by evil spirits. And the offspring were the Huns. Well, what's really not plausible, even if you leave out the supernatural part, it's not too plausible, because how is it that the children then didn't speak Gothic? If their mothers were Gothic, why didn't the kids speak Gothic? Okay, they spoke Hunnic. Hunnic, we don't know what it is. We don't know what the Hunnic language was. We know that it wasn't the same as Gothic, and we know that a lot of Huns eventually learned Gothic. That's how they managed their Hunnic empire in Europe. But the Hunnic language could be a Mongolian kind of a thing. It could be a Turkic kind of a thing. Ural, Altaic, whatever that is. I mean, nobody actually knows. And only 3 words remain to us from the Hunnic language. Those 3 words are of Indo-European origin, but that doesn't necessarily suggest that the Hunnic language itself was an Indo-European language. It probably wasn't. It just, borrowed words are probably the ones that are left to us. Okay, so well, the Huns, we're going to paragraph 5. The Huns, you follow this little green arrow. You see here the Huns are coming out of the east. or out of the forest where their mothers had been impregnated by the evil spirits. They're coming from the east, and they're landing in the Great Hungarian Plain as a fine place for them to graze their ponies, because that was their MO. You know, these people lived on horseback. They were herdsmen. They hardly did any agriculture. They probably did a little bit here and there now and then, but you know, they didn't settle farms. They herds, nomadic herding was their way of living. And however, they were very, very good militarily, because here they were on horseback, and they made bows and arrows out of bone, and absolutely terrorized these poor Goths who were sedentary farmers. The Goths had metal weapons, but they were no match for a bunch of horsemen with bows and arrows. You know, this is like part of the story of medieval France or something. You know, here come these marauding people. You know, terror from a distance can shoot at you. You know, and so we don't know too much about the numbers. But we do know that in the year 376, a huge group of Goths arrived at the Danube, fleeing the Huns. Okay, so now this would be maybe like, if you look at how the pink line, you know, that says Ostrogoths, well, it really wasn't the Ostrogoths, it was kind of any and all Goths, were moving away from the Black Sea, trying to get away from the Huns. Something like 100,000 of them arrived at the Danube, wanting to get into the Roman Empire in the year 376. The reporter, Ammianus Marcellinus, is somewhat reliable on some other subjects, so we suppose that his numbers weren't crazy. So how many Huns were chasing them is always a question. And scholars are thinking that it could have been 10,000, it could have been 20,000. It can't have been too many more, because people do these studies. They say, well, each Hun had to have so many horses or ponies. And how many ponies can you feed on the Great Hungarian Plain? You know, I mean, so people try to figure it out that way. But anyway, it's clear that the number of Huns was probably a good deal smaller than the number of Goths they were chasing. But they chased them effectively anyway. And then the Huns, they ran a protection racket. I mean, if they actually could enter your territory, first they'd kill a bunch of you and kill your leaders, and then they'd say, well, you know, if you'll give us such and such an amount of your agricultural produce, then we'll protect you, right? So that was how they operated. They just, you know, ran a protection racket across what we would now call Hungary and Romania and all the Balkans, and then later they went their way into other places. Let me see. You have, okay, the Huns, let's see, the Huns are in green here, right? So you have this green line going way south, almost into Greece, you see that? And then, but then they stopped, you know, I mean, this is raiding rather than conquering. They didn't ever become the dominant force in Greece. But they beat the Romans in lots of places, and they began to extract tribute from the Romans, like, well, okay, you know, we're going to be really, we're going to help you out, or we're going to stop attacking you if you'll just give us 2,000 pounds of gold a year, you know, or something like that. And they succeeded with that kind of an approach, because the Roman Empire was beginning to fall apart anyway as we approached 400 AD. There were other things going on that were problems for the Romans. Okay, so we talked, I mentioned that the Huns were very terrifying in their military presence. And part of this, too, was the fact that they were said to look very weird. Now, there's a reason, besides them being partly Mongolian extraction, they probably were. Genetics show that there's some kind of mixture of East Asian and Caucasian. Besides that, the Huns practiced some head binding stuff that they did to infants, so that their skulls looked very strange. You know, they had strangely shaped heads. So besides, being these terrifying people who were coming at you on horseback with bows and arrows, they hardly even looked like people. It was just frightening thing. Okay, the Huns dominated in Europe for less than 100 years, in fact. They arrived in Europe maybe in the 370s, and they tried to attack the Eastern Roman Empire in the 390s. At some point in the 440s, they beat the Romans, but the Huns were spreading themselves ever thinner in this quest to, for new lands and new sources of booty. And Attila was a very successful leader, but he died in 453. On your map, you see Chalon 451. This is the first major defeat of the Huns by the Romans. The Romans, in an alliance with some of the Goths, I think the Visigoths were fighting on the Roman side, and then the Ostrogoths were fighting on the Hunnic side, and there were all kinds of other people, all kinds of other tribes, but I'm not going to get into it. You have these masses fighting one another, and the Huns did not win at Chalon, and they were turned back. They started to retreat. They didn't exactly lose. They weren't conquered, but they said, okay, well, we can't go any further than this. They started to go home into Hungary. And then in 453, Attila, on one of his many wedding nights, he died. There are all kinds of stories about this. So, why did he die on his wedding night? We don't actually know. Supposedly died of a nosebleed, But after his death, his sons fought one another. He didn't ever have the sort of political bureaucracy that the Romans had had. So he never had a machinery for running his dominion. And so after he was gone, it wasn't long before other groups began to assert their original identity. The Ostrogoths getting together. The Visigoths asked permission to enter the Roman Empire in 376, and it was granted. The Ostrogoths also asked, but it was not granted. I don't know why. Why the one group was allowed in and the others weren't. And then some of the Huns probably went back to Asia, where they came from, by the end of the 5th century. And others were just absorbed into the local population. The Hun presence in what we call Hungary, no, there's no Huns there. I mean, the Magyars came in the 9th century. There's no relation to the Huns whatsoever. It's just somehow that name, Hungary, stuck. And I don't know through what language it stuck exactly. All right, out of my 16 paragraphs, I think I've just completed number 7, and it seems like a nice moment to stop for a comment or question from the audience if anybody has anything. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that a lot of this information became known through Russian archaeology. What did they find that leads to any of this information?
Yeah, it's that they find certain patterns of how grave goods are distributed, so, certain ways of burial that you could follow from one place to another. And you say, well, this could have been just the spread of a habit, or it could have been people actually moving, and this is the direction that they moved. Okay, so the fact that they've unearthed a lot of new burials in Poland, Ukraine, Bulgaria, blah, 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 is what underpins some of the... It's not completely contradictory of whatever the classical historians were saying, but you get a good deal more detail if you see which groups were burying weapons with their people. The Goths didn't, for instance, bury weapons for some reason, for the most part. Is that sort of an answer?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I'm very interested in archaeology.
Yeah.
And you have to go frequently through graves to see what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know whether or not there were any leftover villages, which obviously the village wouldn't be there, but they archaeologically they find holes and patterns and.
They must have found something, because some of these books have, sort of a diagram of what a Gothic house would have looked like in such and such a place. So I don't know too much about, how robust that is, but they think they know something about the habits of daily living. Anybody else want to say anything at this point? Okay, so now we can follow the Vandals and the Visigoths to Spain. They both went there. The Vandals, it shows the Vandals coming out of Poland, with same, just a little south of where the Goths were in Poland, is where the Vandals started out, and they started going southeast also. But for exactly the same reason that the Goths turned westward, so did the Vandals, because they ran into, guess who? The Huns, right? So it's like, oops, better go the other way. Okay, so the Vandals went westward. They marauded through France, but they didn't settle there. They began to settle. Oh, I don't know, what color are the Vandals on this thing? Yeah, that's sort of a blue line is the Vandals. And it shows them going down into Spain and then into North Africa. Actually, the Vandals tried to settle in Spain. They did so in the early part of the 5th century. The Vandals were settled in Spain. But along came the Visigoths and pushed them out, is what really happened. The Visigoths had left the Danube in 376, if you recall, but they didn't. Quickly, the Vandals, the Visigoths, became not on good terms with the Romans. They defeated them at Adrianople, over here on the map, in 378. The Visigoths won, but the Visigoths didn't conquer any territory. So they sort of kept moving. You can see the purple line of the Visigoths going down into Greece and then up over the hump, over the Adriatic, and then down into Italy. It was Visigoths who sacked Rome in 410, but they didn't conquer Italy, they just marauded and, raided Rome and ruined things. And then they moved on, still going west, and they came into Spain where they seemed to be able to settle. But to do that, they had to kind of push the Vandals along. So that's what happened. They pushed the Vandals along. And
Some are Christians, some are not.
All of the people that we've talked about so far are either Arians or they're still in their original pagan, to the extent that they're Christian, they're Arians.
Okay.
All of them. The Vandals, the Visigoths, the other Goths, if they were Christianized at all, it was the Arian heresy. Until, as I said, I think in the year around 600, some Visigothic leader decided to convert to Catholic. These things always started from the top. It was always the elites that first, in these societies, it was the elites that adopted the Christian faith. And then maybe it trickled down. But it completely different from the original Christian movement, sort of trickling up from the carpenters and the fishermen, and the slaves and so forth. This is the other way around. It's the top people deciding that they would take it on. The Vandals decided in the 520s that they needed to move on to get away from the Visigoths, and they thought, hey, this guy Gaiseric was their big leader of the early 5th century, and he conceived of this remarkable plan where he was going to move, thousands and thousands of people across the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa, because he could see that there were, or he knew somehow that there were prosperous Roman cities down there in North Africa, and he figured they were there for the taking. And So the Vandals went. They went to North Africa in 425 or 429, something like that. And they got to the city of Hippo at a time when St. Augustine was already lying on his deathbed, or he was ill. They besieged the city of Hippo. They weren't particularly out to get St. Augustine. I mean, they were just, they were just getting whatever they could out of all of these cities.
What year was that?
430 maybe, something around there. And to their credit, despite the word vandalism, the Vandals did not destroy the library or the cathedral of St. Augustine. They understood that this was something special, and they preserved it, believe it or not. The term vandalism comes to us from an 18th century French bishop who was talking about the Vandals' incursion into the city of Rome in 455, where the Vandals were really very destructive. They went there and they just sort of ruined things on purpose, not just taking what they wanted, but also destroying things for the sake of destruction. So that's where we get the idea of the word vandalism comes from some Frenchman like 1,000 years later making that comparison. Oh my goodness, what is all this? Well, the Vandals, this was a point that I really enjoyed in a book about the Vandals. This was a book not written by an ecclesiastical type person at all, some historian. This person said that if you went to a Vandal dinner party in the city of Carthage in the 440s, let's say, that the most likely topic of conversation would be the nature of the Trinity. Okay, now, I've been to dinner parties with quite a few of you. Were we ever talking about the nature of the Trinity? I don't think so.
Well, we will next time.
Next week we've got to talk about the name, because this Arian thing, this was a big thing, that this is how they distinguished themselves from the Catholics whom they were absolutely persecuting. Kill every Catholic you can run into was kind of the attitude of the Vandals in those times.
So how did they get so Christian then?
Well, this started with the conversion of the Goths to Arianism.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the Arianism
Just by Christ.
by Theos. Say that again.
By Christ's followers who deviated into Arianism.
Well, Theos, the original converter of the Goths, happened to have been converted to Christianity at a moment when Arianism was the dominant strain in Italian Christianity.
Christ's followers who
Oh, yes.
deviated into this.
Yes. I mean, the whole thing disperses. Yes, yes, I mean, the Arians considered themselves Christians. They just weren't Catholics. They weren't Nicene, and they didn't want to have anything to do with the Pope. They thought their Christ was better than your Christ, I mean, it's our Christ. This is Christ is on our side, right? That's how it always is. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, we're going to switch now totally to talk about the Franks. So the Franks on your map are coming down from that same magical area, sort of just south of Denmark, and they're going to the west, and they're going to Normandy and other parts of what we would now call France. The big uniter, the early uniter of the Franks was a leader named Clovis. He united very much of France. In fact, all but sort of the southeastern corner of France was united by Clovis around the year 500 AD. And Clovis, unlike, back up. Bishop Gregory of Tours, writing in the late 6th century, like maybe 80 years after Clovis's exploits, said that the conversion of Clovis to Catholicism was an accomplishment of Clovis's wife, who was a Catholic. Now, according to Bishop Gregory of Tours, the winning argument, there were lots of arguments between Clovis and his wife, and the one that finally succeeded was the wife said to him, "Oh, please, what have Mars and Mercury ever done for anybody?" And the reason this makes actually no sense whatsoever is that there's no chance that Clovis was ever a worshiper of Mars and Mercury. Either he was a worshiper of Thor and Wotan and Freya and those people, or it's possible that his family had already been Christianized and he would have been an Arian, who knows. Anyway, somehow he was married to this Catholic lady and she managed to get him on board with becoming a Catholic. So the Frankish leadership was Nicene Catholic that early, by the early, probably around 500, that he was converted to that. An explanation that I've thought of about why Bishop Gregory thought that this Mars and Mercury argument, might have happened that way, is that maybe Gregory himself was not a good writer of Latin, and he's writing his history in Latin, and maybe Mars and Mercury was his way of translating Thor and Wotan. See what I mean? When he says that the wife was joshing him for being, for worshiping Mars and Mercury. Maybe it actually wasn't Mars and Mercury, but how does he put the names of Germanic deities into Latin? Maybe that's my hypothesis. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, keep in mind that Frankish, the Franks are not Romance. Frankish is not a Romance language, it's a Germanic language. The Franks are German. The name France comes from the name of some Germans. Sorry about that, that's the way it is. They're German. German. Okay, all right, so supposedly Clovis founded the Merovingian dynasty, which, his descendants did continue in some kind of royal position, but actually the Merovingian Empire quickly split into several pieces, and it seems as though the leaders of those pieces were in fact more powerful than the Merovingian emperors ever were. They were kind of emperors in name, but they didn't have much sway. In fact, the Frank that I really want to draw your attention to, the person who was the power behind the throne in the Frankish Eastern Kingdom, Austrasia, the person who was the mother of a Frankish king and then the grandmother of the next Frankish king, or maybe it goes the other way around, I have to figure that out. Anyway, this woman who was the big power in the Frankish domain around the year 600 is a person you've heard of, and her name starts with a B, and she's known to you through the opera. Who knows? That's it, Brunhilde. Brunhilde was a real person. Who knew Brunhilde was a real person? Guess what? She wasn't the daughter of Wotan. She was the daughter of a Visigoth king, and, keep in mind the Visigoths were also German, right? Frankish and Gothic are not the same language, but, somehow the two managed to communicate. And this woman came up to the Frankish Empire, was married to a Frankish leader at that time. I just find it very amusing to know that Brunhilde was actually somebody. All right, let's see, where do we go from here? Well, I have left the Ostrogoths behind a little bit. You remember that the Visigoths came into the Roman Empire in 376 when they arrived at the Danube and the Romans let them in. The Ostrogoths were not so fortunate. They really were dominated by the Huns for the better part of a century. Then finally, after Attila's death, the Ostrogoths were able to regroup themselves and they moved. And you can follow the little Ostrogoth arrow, which is pink. And they move across the Balkans and they come down into Italy. They arrived in Italy with some assent from the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire had fallen apart, okay, by the late 5th century. And the Ostrogoths arrive in Italy at a time when the Roman Senate still exists, and some Roman administrative machinery still exists, like the mint, and a bunch of bureaucrats are still hanging around, but there's no military force that's Roman, that can. So the Ostrogoths come in with their military force, and Theodoric, their famous Theodoric the Great, he manages to deliver some number of decades of peace and prosperity. So he got not only all of Italy under his sway, but also Croatia and Slovenia. He had sort of an empire of his own. He tried to arrange for his succession to continue all that. He married each of his children to the son or daughter of some other powerful European leader. He had those machinations about how his line was going to continue, and they were going to keep on ruling Italy. But actually, after Theodoric died, his line of succession went on a little bit, but they weren't impressive and they weren't successful, and the Eastern Roman Empire said, good, now I'm going to send in the Lombards and get rid of those bozos, get rid of those Ostrogoths. So the Ostrogoths, their fall occurred probably in the 540s or the 550s, and some of them stayed in Italy and were just kind of absorbed into the local population, and a large number of them actually went to Bavaria. Now this is nice. The Germans finally get to Germany. Remember, they came from Poland and they went over to the Black Sea, so now they're in the Ukraine, so now they come south through Romania and Bulgaria, and then they cross back over and they wind up in Italy and they rule there for a while. They finally get pushed out. Then they go to Bavaria. So, as I said, now finally the Germans are in Germany where they belong. Okay, yay. We have gone past my favorite year, the year 525 AD. This is the year in which a monk from the Black Sea area came to Rome. Now this is the Ostrogoths are ruling in Italy at this point, but the church is still, it's got its own power structure. So, the Pope is still there in Rome and everything. So this monk comes to Rome, and he's one of these people, laboriously writing tracts. And the tract that he wrote, he said he did a whole lot of arithmetic, and he asserted this is 525 Anno Domini. He said this year is 525 years after the birth of Christ. Up till then, nobody ever did the calendar that way. They were not doing AD and BC. They were doing this is the 14th year of Hadrian's reign, as if we were talking about what happened in the second year of the Millard Fillmore administration. That's how they spoke about history. This happened when Constantine had been in power for 4 years or something. So even though Constantine invented Christmas in the year 312, Constantine never said this is the year 312. It was whatever year it was, I don't know. And it's astonishing to me to think about something like Attila's death in 453, and to realize that not only did Attila not think of it as 453, which of course he wouldn't have because he wasn't Christian, but none of the Christians thought of it that way either. You know, to them it was the such and such year of Valentinian's reign or something like that, you know. And so this little monk with it's been 525 years since the birth of Jesus, this didn't catch on right away, but it caught on in a few places, and after a couple of hundred years it was very much popularized by the Venerable Bede writing in Britain. And then everybody started using it, you know, and okay, AD and BC, Anno Domini, and then years before Christ. The only thing was, you know, Dionysius Exiguus made an arithmetic error because it wasn't 525, it was actually 529 years after the birth of Christ. And that's why we now tell each other that Christ was born in 4 BC. And we know this has to be so because didn't King Herod die in 3 BC or something? So if Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, am I saying something familiar? You know, how can you figure it out? Well, it's that Dionysius Exiguus made an error in his calculations. Okay, fine, but that's where that AD BC thing got started, was in 525. All right, blah, blah, blah. Oh yes, so I was going to go back to the Franks because, of course, what is this? Well, so the Franks are chugging along, and now we're into century 6, century 7. What's happening in century 7? That's the Mohammed thing, right? And here come the Moors across North Africa and into Spain in the year 711. And they defeat the Visigoths immediately. The Visigoths you can kind of tell from the fact that the Visigothic king had converted to Catholicism. You can kind of tell that the Visigoths weren't much of a power because, you know, they kind of went, okay, you know, we're going to be Catholic now. Okay, so now here come the Moors, and they smash the Visigoths, and then they're trying to get into France because the Moorish idea is they're going to encircle the whole Mediterranean, and then they're going to be in charge of pretty much everything, right? Okay. But Charles the Bastard, later known to us as Charles Martel, he was a military leader of some talent, and he managed to push back a Moorish force that was probably superior in numbers, but it just, you know, the first battle, he managed to stop them for a little while. And the Battle of Tours in 732 is sort of one of these famous dates you're supposed to remember. Actually, the Franks kept having to fight the Moors for at least a decade. You know, the Moors kept trying. They didn't just say, oh, they beat us, goodbye. You know, but they kept trying. They kept trying to push their way around. And what happened after a decade or so was that some events at home, some events in the Umayyad Caliphate made the Moors decide that, no, this isn't worth it, actually. We can't concentrate on this right now. And so they left, you know. So it wasn't so much that the Franks beat them back as that the Franks resisted long enough for the Moors to give up. And so we can say that Charles Martel saved Europe for Christianity, sort of. Something else. Oh yeah, the Battle of Tours. It's very funny. The Battle of Tours, where they now think that it actually occurred, was not right at Tours, but closer to Poitiers. But we can't call it the Battle of Poitiers because the Battle of Poitiers is something that happened in the 14th century with the Black Prince. You know, it's where the English beat the French. So to British historians, the Battle of Poitiers is really important. Well, we can't go back and reclaim, you know, the Battle of Tours as being a Battle of Poitiers. So we don't just call it the Battle of Tours, even though it probably didn't happen there. All right. Blah, blah, blah. I'm looking at the clock. I just have a few minutes, so I'll just tell you my one Charlemagne story, my favorite Charlemagne story. Charlemagne, was the grandson of Charles Martel. Charlemagne, so, now this turns from the Merovingian to the Carolingian Empire, and these people do have some power. And so this is a wonderful book that I've read, more than any other book that I haven't mentioned any others, so I'll just mention this one. It's called The Germanization of Early Medieval Christianity. And the book, to me, is like a cartoon, and it goes like this. This is the book, in short, in very brief. Here's Charlemagne on the phone with the Pope. Hello, Pope. Charlemagne here. I'm having an awful lot of trouble with these Lombards. Do you think you could lend me some troops, Pope? The Pope says, sure thing, Chuck. But you elite Franks, you're Catholic, that's fine. But a lot of your peeps up there, they're still doing this Thor and Wotan thing. And I'm sort of tired of it, Do you think you can get them to adopt Jehovah and Jesus instead? Sure thing, Pope, I'm on it. I'm going to do it right away. We'll just make sure that they're all going to be Christians, Catholics. Great. Okay. So the people were told, I think something like, Thor and Wotan have helped you in these wars that you've been conducting, but Jehovah and Jesus are going to help you a lot more. So why don't you just, let's do it that way. And the people go, okay, fine. So do they have a catechism like the early Christians? No, they don't. Are they taught that Jesus was preaching mercy and love? No, they're not. Jesus is going to really help you, beat your enemies. So is it any wonder that after a few hundred years, these same people are running down to Jerusalem to kill the Saracens, right? Okay, so I love that book for that reason. In terms of books, the really good one on everything that I've said would be by an Englishman. He's about 60 years old. His name is Peter Heather. He's at the University of London. He has a big fat book called Empires and Barbarians. And for about 30 years, he's been kind of the foremost English-speaking expert on the Huns and the Goths and the Vandals and the Franks and the Syrian, the Heruli and the Alans and the Sarmatians and all the other groups that I didn't even mention. So, he knew all about that. Okay, finally. Okay, well, I think actually finally I can give up because I already said it. I was talking about the sources. There's some classical sources that are useful. Jordanus is useful even though he's full of fiction and you have to throw out 3/4 of it. There was a man named Priscus who visited Attila's headquarters in about 440 or something and wrote quite a lengthy account about that. We know something from him. We know something from this Ammianus Marcellinus about the arrival of the hordes of Goths at the Danube in 376. And half a dozen other classical historians from whom we know something. And then what we really know, the only other stuff that we know comes from the much more recent archaeological digs, and of course philologists have done a lot because the philologists have the Gothic language thanks to Philos. British philologists think they can even figure out how it was pronounced. So British philologists think, this is some man writing about 1915 I think, I'm just thinking that if a 4th century Goth arrived in Stonington, just washed up, we would understand him in about a week. Thria Honda, what do you think that means? Yeah, that's what it means. So 300 is what it means. I mean, it means just what it sounds like. And a lot of the other stuff that an early Goth would say, we'd go, oh, I think he means this, you know. Fascinating. All right, well, that's enough for me now. Any further questions or remarks?
How did the Vandals become maritime powers?
Yes, they learned it in Spain. They settled on the shore in Spain. This map is funny because it doesn't show them settling on the shore in Spain, but actually they came down into southeastern Spain. I'm not going to argue with the map. I'm just saying it was when they were still in Spain, they learned from local people how to do ships, and that's how it was that after they got to Carthage, they were able to go by sea and raid Rome and Sardinia and Sicily and all these other places. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, Marilyn.
Well, this is sort of a personal question, if you don't mind. If you don't want to answer it, just say.
We'll see.
Okay. I mean, you are a scientist.
Yes.
With a doctorate in astrophysics, correct?
No, planetary science, not the same, but yeah.
Scientist.
Yeah.
And yet you know all this historical, I mean, how do you know all this stuff?
Yeah, so we can blame it on St. Brendan's because it was because of, joining St. Brendan's. I got kind of interested in reading about the early Christians. You know what I was saying about the fishermen and the carpenters somehow becoming the religion of the Roman. And I read about 10 books, about early Christianity and how the martyrs and the St. Paul, obviously, and the absence of infanticide and, some other factors that help this little nothing religion sort of become the big thing, okay? So, but how somehow in that progress through the early Christians, that's when I ran into this book about the Germanization of early medieval Christianity. And so then, from getting a little bit interested in the Goths and the Franks, and then I sort of went back and I went, hey, this stuff is great because it's what nobody knows. Nobody knows. Nobody our age knows it, that's for sure. And I mean, it just isn't taught, it's not part of it. Okay. So now, but you reminded me of one more thing that I could say, which I should have said, which is climate science thinks it knows something about where the Huns came from. Tree rings from Central Asia, and I'm talking about 2 or 3 trees. There are not a lot of trees that are 2,000 years old, but there were some trees that were old enough for them to deduce that there was probably a massive drought in Central Asia in the middle of the 4th century. And so the Huns, with their millions of ponies and their cattle, and they had to go somewhere. And why they drifted west is I don't know, but that's the way they drifted. And that's when they began to run into these other people and push them all into the Roman Empire. Okay, that's it.
Is an archaeologist, and he was invited by the country of Syria to come in and to excavate some major valley that was about to be flooded. And they gave him 2 or 3 years to do this. And he went in and he took, not only did he dig, he took cores, big, huge cores and soil samples, obviously, of the whole area. And he came up with, eventually, the fact that somewhere way, thousands of years ago, there was a major planetary event with some kind of a meteor hitting and created a dark space for quite a while, which was, it forced people out of the area, and it became basically the time when hunter-gatherer had to stop being hunter-gatherer and they became farmers.
Oh, interesting.
I can't quite put it
Yeah,
all
okay,
together
you've given
for
us
you,
the idea.
and he
interesting.
then gave a lecture I just added about a month ago about how climate change has evolved over the years and forced
Oh, yeah.
there and everywhere, and changed how they went about living.
Yeah,
Really, really interesting.
yeah.
And the climate in the middle of the 5th century in Europe also influenced the Danube was freezing,
Hmm.
and they could cross,
Uh-huh, right.
Yeah,
and these people could pour through. It's
it
fascinating.
is really interesting.
Excuse me, since we're recording this,
Oh,
it would be helpful if you dropped your masks while we're talking. It would be a little clearer on the recording.
hi, George.
Thank you.
This gentleman has, his artifacts are in many museums around the world. The first bunch I saw were in the Ashmolean. It's-
Oxford.
In Oxford,
Ah.
exactly, yeah. He's writing a book right now on a very early settlement in Croatia that he dug for 3 or 4 years.
Neat.
It's fascinating how we can find out who we've been
Yeah,
from.
stuff that's still
Post
around.
holes,
Yeah.
Grave holes.
Mhm. Nice.
Thank you.
Okay, I had fun, that's what counts.
And we created a forum for you.
Yes, absolutely.